Sorry, just a minute.
You are live.
Okay, whoops, that didn't go. That door didn't shut. There we go. So we are back. This is the Senate Education Committee on January 29th, in the afternoon. We're back after a short break. With us today, and this moment I'll say indirectly helping us prepare for everything that is to come this year. We have Beth St. James from Legislative Council, and we asked her to come in and we have new members and even returning, it's always good to hear, refresh our memory about some of the legislation that has passed through this committee over the last 2 to 4 years, whatever, and I know that we've kind of prioritized it. So this is going to be sort of a high-ish level, just a reminder, and we can see where that leads us. I think you know everybody at the table.
I'm sorry?
You do know everybody at the table? Okay.
Yes.
And we've done that a couple times
Yes.
already today, so we won't repeat. But for the record,
Beth St. James, Office of Legislative Council.
and the floor is yours.
Thank you. Good afternoon. So on your website, you should have a 9-page handout that's just a Word document, but it is hot links to all of the legislation I will talk to you all about today. So if you click on it, it should take you directly to the act. I do have a hard stop at 4:15 today, so hopefully we will finish it. If not, we'll make that plan. But what I have for you today is all of the legislation that either passed through the education committees or touches on education and somehow from last biennium. And then after all of that, starting on page 6, I have a list of often referenced past legislation. I couldn't think of a better title.
So let me just say, in response to you setting that up, we don't need to rush. If we end up getting through part of this and then we come back, that's totally fine.
Great. I will go at your pace. Do you want to start with often referenced past legislation? And I'm starting with Act 173 in 2018 and moving my way up, or do you want to start with the last biennium?
It sounds like it might make sense to go back.
Sure.
Start with the often referenced.
Sure. So if you go to page 6, we're going to start with Act 173, which was enacted in 2018. And the title of that act is an act relating to enhancing the effectiveness, availability, and equity of services provided to students who require additional support. So this is, as your chair mentioned, this is going to be very high level. The notes that I have for you on this handout are not meant to be exhaustive of every detail in each bill.
Good.
And they are not meant to represent any opinion of mine of what you should pay attention to or what you should not. This is just my experience working with this legislation and the parts of these bills that I have most commonly worked with, and therefore I think you would most commonly refer to. So there's more to the story, is all I'm saying. Okay, so Act 173 is something that you all will hear referenced commonly in the area of special education. So you can see there's kind of there's 4, but there's 3 main bullet points under this act. So there was amendments made to how services were delivered. There was large funding changes to how special education funding works. And then there were changes made that impacted the independent schools. So Act 173 added a definition of a student who requires additional support. So students with an individualized education program, which we call an IEP, or students with a 504 plan, that's federal, both the IEP and the 504 plan fall under federal legislation. So what Act 173 did is it expands beyond just referencing those students who require additional support under federal law. What does it mean? What about other kiddos who maybe don't qualify under those federal laws but do need additional support? So students on neither of the above 2 plans, but whose ability to learn is negatively impacted by a disability or by social, emotional, or behavioral needs, or whose ability to learn is negatively impacted because the student is otherwise at risk. Students for whom English is not the primary language, or students who read below grade level. Those are all now students who require additional support. In Vermont, we use something called the multi-tiered systems of support. If you have questions about that, I am not your gal. That is really a question for the field and how multi-tiered systems of support are implemented in the field. But there are, just as it sounds, tiers of support, levels of support meant to provide students with the additional support they need in the most generalized education environment possible. And so what Act 173 did is it prohibits the use of tiered systems of academic and behavioral support from denying a timely initial comprehensive special education evaluation for children with a suspected disability. So just because you are receiving additional support on a tier 1 or tier 2, that cannot be used as a reason to say, well, we're not gonna give you an evaluation to see if you need even more support. It requires AOE to provide professional development and support to implement the changes, and it created 3 new positions at AOE to support special education. The funding changes in Act 173 were significant. So prior to Act 173, special education funding was a reimbursement model where the state was funding 60% of all special education costs through a combination of grants and reimbursements. And Act 173 changed it to a census-based model where the state will provide categorical aid, a grant, to each supervisory union based on historical special education spending per student. So went from reimbursement to categorical aid on historical spending basis.
So the aid is therefore proactive, ahead of, not rather than being after the fact.
Yes. It's categorical aid. So it's coming, my colleagues at JFO will hate that I'm using this term, but it's the easiest to understand off the top of the ed funds. With other categorical aid. I would say special education, when you are talking about categorical aid, is probably the largest category. CTE is categorical aid to some parts of it, transportation, school meals, all coming off the top of the ed fund. How you calculate that census-based funding is built right into statute. And if you eventually want to do a deeper dive on that, I'm happy to do that, but we don't have time for that today, given all else you want to accomplish. There was a gradual transition built in. So there were, full implementation isn't until fiscal year 2027. So we moved past a reimbursement model, but the actual law builds in kind of this on-ramp to get you to where you will eventually be. It expanded the allowable use of special education funds, and it changed the threshold in calculation for extraordinary cost calculations that is above your census block grant. The other main category, when I think of Act 173, are the changes for independent schools. So Act 173 requires an independent school that accepts public tuition to enroll any student with an IEP who is placed in the approved independent school by the student's local education agency, except for that does not apply to therapeutic schools. And that was effective July 1, 2023. So starting.
Just curious, sir. Okay. Can you roll back to the comment you made about therapeutic schools? Like, so the relationship between independent schools, IEPs, therapeutic schools, in relationship, how does they relate to public schools?
So independent schools are privately governed organizations. They're private schools. In order to operate in Vermont and for a kiddo to attend and be meeting the compulsory attendance requirements, students either have to be homeschooled, enrolled in a public school, or enrolled in an approved education program, which is like teen parent programs, or in an independent school, either an approved or recognized. Therapeutic schools are schools that limit their enrollment totally to students who are on an IEP. So there's no one in those schools. They're serving special populations. If you want a kiddo to meet the compulsory attendance requirement, they have to be enrolled in one of those categories of schools. So they're either in a public school setting where they're getting services, And public schools can have special education programs that are serving just those populations, or they have to be enrolled in an independent school. And so most therapeutic schools are approved independent schools. But they're only serving students, certain populations of disabilities. And so what this is saying is general education approved independent schools, in order to qualify for public tuition, you have to agree to accept any student on an IEP if their local education agency thinks it's the best place for them. It's a good placement for them. But therapeutic schools are limited to, most of them, not all, but most of them are limited to serving certain populations. So not every student on an IEP may be a good fit for those may get the services they need at those therapeutic schools. So that carve out is saying general education schools, you have to accept anyone on an IEP, but we're not going to make that same requirement of schools that limit enrollment to just specific populations.
Just for clarity, IEPs, I assume there's like a range of IEPs, you know, severity, types of schools, which would be more appropriate for one classification of IEP versus another. There's a range of them. Would that be?
So IEP stands for Individualized Education Plan. So yes, these are very individual plans for every student's needs.
Okay, so if a student were on an IEP, he's in a public school, does public schools also, are they required to accept or to handle students with IEPs?
Yes, the public school is required to accept anyone who walks in the door.
Okay, but if we're, so again, this is again, I'm not needling anything, I just don't understand. With the range of IEPs, if a district doesn't have it, if the district utilizes an independent school and there's a student with an IEP, if the independent school doesn't have the specialization to address the particular needs of that student, are they required to go? I mean,
so the way the law works is that the approved independent schools have to agree to accept a student who's placed there by their local education agency. So theoretically, there is a team of people supporting this student who are identifying that school as an appropriate placement for that child.
Okay.
And so I'm guessing that they are not going to identify schools that they don't think could meet the needs of that child. But this is only for schools that want to accept public tuition. So if an approved independent school does not want to accept public tuition, they do not have to enroll any student on an IEP. Does that answer your question?
Is this working? Does this work?
Yeah, I think that the four academies obviously provide the full range of services.
Without the use of the therapeutic schools, they cover any student in their district so if I'm just trying to figure out like how strict this in the sentence sounds like. You get assigned, then
No, you don't get assigned. I think this would be a great question for the field, right? I'm not in the field, but if you are a tuition, so the supervisory union is the LEA. LEA, Legal Education Agency, is a federal concept, and they are basically administrative units designated by each state to do certain things. So every state's going to have different political subdivisions of the state that are their designated local education agencies. In Vermont, it's the supervisory union. So ultimately, if a child has special needs, it is the supervisory union's responsibility to make sure that that child is receiving the services and the education that they are entitled to. If this is a tuitioning district or a public school, if there is a child that is their IEP team, their local education agency, and all their service providers get together and they decide the public school is not the right fit, or we are a non-operating district, and so we therefore, the next door public school is not the right fit, but this independent school is the right fit for a myriad of reasons, they would make that recommendation, and then ultimately the student could choose whether or not to enroll in that school. For therapeutic schools exist because there are some children that have a higher need that can be served in general education schools, so public schools or approved independent schools. And those decisions on whether or not a therapeutic school is right for a child are going to be made on an individual family basis, likely with the input of their care team, with their IEP team and all their other social service providers.
Okay, thank you.
In the interest of time, I'm just going to say there was rulemaking required to be updated to special education rules and the state board of the independent school rules to take into account all the changes that happened in Act 173. In the special session of 2018, Acts and Resolves number 11 created the Commission on Public School Employee Health Benefits. I've added no context here. This is the current law for public school health benefits. This is the act that it came out of, how they are bargained for on statewide level. 2019 Acts and Resolves number 1, commonly referred to as Act 1. The Act 1 Working Group, an act relating to ethnic and social equity studies standards for public schools, created the Ethnic and Social Equity Standards Advisory Working Group to review standards for student performance adopted by the state board and recommend updates and additional standards to recognize fully the history, contributions, and perspectives of ethnic and social groups. And then that group also was required to review statutes, rules, and policies that concern or impact standards for student performance or curriculum and recommend changes to you all. And then the state board was required to consider those recommendations and consider adopting ethnic and social equity studies standards into the standards for student performance. And they did just that in June of 2024. Their Education Quality Standards Rule Series 2000 was updated in 2024, and I believe the rules go into effect in July of 2025. Acts 2021, Acts and Resolves number 28, an act relating to improving pre-kindergarten through grade 12 literacy within the state. Prior to the work you all did last year on literacy, this was the main literacy bill that had come out of the legislature in the last several years. So it appropriated ARPA money to provide some professional development learning modules for teachers and methods of teaching literacy, to assist supervisory unions in implementing evidence-based systems, and for AOE to retrain some contractors to provide technical assistance and recommend evidence-based practices in teaching literacy, etc. It also created the Advisory Council on Literacy to advise both the executive branch and you all on how to improve and sustain proficiency outcomes in literacy for students in pre-K through 12. Act 72 came out of the 2021 session, and that is the act that commissioned the School Facilities Condition Index, that, should you choose to take up the topic of school construction, will be a core topic. So it required AOE to conduct a school facilities inventory and conditions assessment of all public schools. It required school districts and SUs to designate a person as the facilities manager, and then required AOE to establish guidelines for training and certification of such managers. It required school districts to develop and maintain 5-year capital operation and improvement plans. It created the Renewable and Efficiency Heating Systems Grant Program, and it required all public and independent schools to perform radon testing. I'd say, in my experience, and everyone who is touched by legislation will have different opinions of what was the most important. So I'm not saying it's the most important. I'd say the most commonly referenced thing to come out of Act 72 is that Conditioned Facilities Index. Act 127, an act relating to improving student equity by adjusting the school funding formula and providing education quality and funding oversight. This is the bill that adjusted pupil weights. So it changed weights There was a cap on homestead property tax rates that was then repealed by last year's yield bill. Actually, it was not the yield bill, it was a different piece of legislation that we'll walk through that happened in the beginning of the year, and replaced it with a mechanism to provide a tax rate decrease for districts that lost taxing capacity and changes due to changes in Act 127. It suspended the excess spending penalty, the hold harmless provision, and ballot language requirements, but both the excess spending penalty and the ballot language requirements were reinstated in the yields bill. It created categorical aid for some districts with English learner students based on the number of EL students enrolled. And it also required certain services to be provided to EL students. And then it added some positions to the Agency of Education related to support for EL students, the Universal Income Declaration form, and financial data and analysis for AOE. It created requirements for school districts to meet district quality standards and required AOE to adopt rules for those standards. And it commissioned the report on CT funding and governance structures. You received the funding report last year. I think you are awaiting the governance structure report imminently. And that act was from 2022. And so those were the big pieces of legislation that came through the education committees that I think you will commonly hear referenced that occurred prior to last biennium. Going back to 2018, there's lots more before that.
Questions?
So when writing up these acts, like that last one in Act number 72 required all to do radon testing. Mm-hmm. Did like a committee like us put that in there, or when you drafted up?
Oh, this is a great question.
Yes. Where and why didn't they follow it up with anything other than you're required to do it and then leave it at that? It doesn't.
So first I will say this, I would encourage you to click on that hot link and actually read the language about radon testing. Right. I did not include all of the details on the fallout from that requirement, but I make no decisions in my job. I am here to advise you on your legal options and to make sure that Title 16 makes sense in its organization and the language we're all using, but whether or not to put something into a bill is completely your jurisdiction and decision.
So this came from the House and the Senate combined agreeing? Yes.
Okay. Everything on this handout was enacted into law, is law.
So I feel the need for a visual aid because all these acts are so important to what we're doing right now, the process. But once we get a new process, what happens to all these acts? They go in a history book somewhere?
Do you want me to answer that?
Sure.
Well, my office maintains all of the acts and resolves and introduced bills ever, right? So to the extent that it lives in the history books, yes. But the changes you make may necessitate changing existing law. But I don't know what those are yet, so I can't say whether any of these this previous legislation would need changes.
We need to take all these into consideration because obviously they're important enough to be enacted.
We do. Yeah.
So we are gonna jump back up to page 1 and go over what the education committees did last biennium. These are in no particular order. Acts and resolves 15. So if there's an asterisk, it means it is legislation that either did not originate in the education committees or did not come through the education committees, but ended up in Title 16, so I want you to know about it. So an act relating to access to legally protected healthcare activity and regulation of healthcare providers created the Access to Reproductive and Gender Affirming Healthcare Services chapter in Title 16. I did not draft this bill. If you have questions about this, I can connect you with the drafter. Acts and resolves, 2023 Acts and resolves number 66, an act relating to miscellaneous changes in education laws. In my short tenure with the legislature, it is extremely common for the education committees to have miscellaneous education bills where you put many different topics, right? Your bills have to the ideas in your bill all have to be germane to what the bill is trying to accomplish. And a miscellaneous bill is a great way to put in lots of little things. So it's not a requirement that you do that. It is just something very common in the education committees, and not every committee does that. So Act 66, suspended implementation and requirement to use SSDDMS, which was a shared data management system that all school districts were required to use. It was in the process of being implemented, and at a certain point in time, there was a decision made to no longer continue implementation and no longer require anyone to use it. But the system existed as it did in 2023, and there were some school districts using it. So all Act 66 did was halt further work on this system and the requirement for school districts to use it, but there are some school districts that still use it. It added courses to non-Vermont approved post-secondary schools when the degree program is not available in Vermont as an allowable use of the National Guard Tuition Benefit Program. It amended home study program requirements. It pushed out the deliverable dates for the Act 1 Ethnic and Social Equity Standards Advisory Working Group, and it amended the number of signatures needed for a union school board nominating candidate petition to current law was just 60 voters. Act 66 said it's 60 voters or 1% of legal voters. That sounds confusing, but if you all are going to get into school district governance, we are going to be talking about nominating petitions and voting. So we will come back to this concept. Act 64, an act relating to school food programs and universal school meals. So in 2022, I did not include it because we have 64, but in 2022, the legislature piloted a one-year universal schools program for public schools only. And then in 2023, the legislature enacted Act 64, which created the Universal Meals Supplement, which required all public schools to provide free breakfast and lunch to all students, and requires approved independent schools to do the same for their publicly tuitioned students if they operate a federal meals program. And it extended eligibility for participation in the Local Foods Incentive Grant Program by adding independent schools that get the Universal Meal Supplement as entities that can participate in the grant program. So universal school meals. And that is, again, one of those pieces of categorical aid that's coming off the top of the Ed Fund. I'm sorry, JFO. Act 29, this committee spent a lot of time on school safety in Act 29. This bill originated in this committee. It requires school districts and approved independent schools to adopt a policy to require options-based response drills twice a year, adopt an all hazards emergency operations plan, and adopt an access control and visitor management policy. It requires AOE to develop a model behavioral threat assessment team policy, and requires each school district to implement policies and procedures at least as comprehensive as that model. It created the working group on student protections from harassment and discrimination in schools to study and give recommendations for how to address harassment and discrimination experienced by students in schools. Act 78, this is the budget for 2023. It made amendments to the Vermont Teachers Retirement Fund. I did not work on that, so if you have questions about those amendments, I can connect you with the drafter. It created the After School and Summer Learning Program Grant Program, which was composed of retail cannabis sales and use tax. And it created a moratorium on the approval of new approved independent schools until further direction from the General Assembly. And there has been no further direction from the General Assembly since that act passed.
Just for clarity, thanks, sir. Does that include therapeutic schools?
Yes. Act 76, the Child Care Bill. This bill did not come through this committee, nor did it obviously originate in this committee, but this committee spent a lot of time working on the Pre-Kindergarten Education Implementation Committee, Section 2. So I have not included any of the provisions related to childcare. I've just focused on pre-K. So this bill created the Pre-K Education Implementation Committee to assist AOE in approving and expanding accessible, affordable, and high-quality pre-K education for children on a full-day basis on or before July 1, 2026. Their report back to you all, I believe, was due in December of this past year of 2024. It required AOE to develop a model contract for school district to use for contracting with private providers for pre-K services. It requires AOE to analyze and issue a report to the General Assembly regarding whether the cost of educating a pre-K student is the same as educating a kindergarten student in the context of a full school day. It requires AOE to submit certain data to JFO. And there was a contingent amendment to the pre-K weights. Right now, in current law, pre-kindergarten students have a negative weight. So they're all considered one full-time student, one ADM, one average daily membership student. But then when you count them all up and you apply a negative weight, you go from a higher number to a lower number, as opposed to when you apply a positive weight, you're most likely going from a lower number to a higher number of students. So this was a contingent amendment to the pre-K weight from negative 0.5 to 0. So elementary students are currently weighted at 0. And it's supposed to not go into effect until the General Assembly enacts certain legislation. So this is certainly the piece of legislation you all want to pay attention to. And then it required AOE to submit a plan to the General Assembly regarding the regulation of early education. Pre-kindergarten education is duly regulated by AOE and AHS. 2024, Acts and Resolves 87, an act related to budget adjustments. It amended the Universal After School and Summer Special Fund. It amended post-retirement adjustments to retirement allowances. And an amendment to the Ed Fund statute, which included costs of revenue collection as an allowable use of the Ed Fund. Act 114, an act relating to post-secondary schools and sexual misconduct protections. Again, a bill that originated in this committee, requires post-secondary schools to ensure students have access to confidential sexual misconduct support services. Requires post-secondary schools to create and adopt an amnesty policy. Requires post-secondary schools to offer annual sexual misconduct primary prevention and awareness programming to all students, staff, and faculty. And it repealed the sunset of the Intercollegiate Sexual Harm Prevention Council, taking them from a temporary body to a body in perpetuity until you should take further action. So on page 3 now, 2024 Acts and Resolves number 168. An act relating to improving access to high quality education through community collaboration. This is the BOCES bill. It created the process performing the governance and the duties of a Board of Cooperative Education Services. That's what BOCES stands for, Board of Cooperative Education Services. 2 or more SUs would enter into a proposed agreement to form an association to deliver shared programs and services to complement the educational programs of the member supervisory unions in a cost-effective manner. All Act 168 did was create the legal structure for these entities to form. It did not require anyone to form them. It did require supervisory unions to get together, talk amongst themselves, and decide whether they wanted to form one. And then it required AOE to take a look at the field and report back to you all with what's going on with BOCES. It created a startup grant program for SUs who have formed a BOCES, so $10,000 per BOCES, and it amended the community schools program from a 3-year pilot program to an open-ended program and appropriated $1 million from the Ed Fund to provide funding for school districts to create community schools.
Set by grant application?
Yes. And that, I would say, the community schools program was a pilot program, so it was created in session law, appropriately so. And what Act 168 did was it removed any references to any year limitations on when the program would be operating. And it made that appropriation, but it didn't take this program out of session law. So if this is something in what you all are going to take on this year that you want to see moving forward in perpetuity, I'm going to suggest that we get it out of session law. Act 149, an act relating to the development of an updated state aid school construction program, created the Facilities Master Plan Grant Program to support the development of educational facilities master plans. That grant program is unfunded. creates a state aid for school construction working group, and it raised the threshold for school districts for what is considered high-cost construction contract from $500,000 to $2 million, and that's in reference to when they have to go seek bids. So for high-cost construction contracts, prior to this change, they had to seek a bid for everything that was $500,000 or more, and that law hadn't been changed in many years. So updating what's high construction, high cost.
Do we have, what does that report do for recommendation for a statewide school construction program?
The committee did not issue a report. They issued recommended legislation. And my colleague, John Ray, this is in his portfolio. I believe the plan was for each side, the Senate and the House, for a couple people to sponsor that legislation, but I don't know what the status of that is.
But that's available.
Oh, yes, it's
Okay.
yes, it's very public, and yep. 24-hour Acts and Resolves, Act 183 is the yield bill. I'm going to skip that and we'll come back to it at the end. We're going to go to page 4, Act 113, an act relating to the budget from last year, amended the adult education and secondary credential program. It lowered the age of eligibility for participation from 20 to 16, and then it repealed the high school completion program. Can anyone guess what the age of eligibility for the high school completion program was based on the amended age for the adult education and secondary credential program? I'm trying to keep everyone awake.
36.
16.
Oh.
So the adult education and secondary credential program was for 20 and up, and the high school completion program was 16 and up. And so they repealed this legislation, repealed the high school completion program, lowered the age for participation in the adult education program, with the theory being that those folks who were eligible to participate in the high school completion program would now also be eligible to participate in the adult education and secondary credential program. It also requires 40% of the payment for adult ed program to come from the ed fund and 60% to come from the general fund. Acts and Resolves, 2024 Acts and Resolves number 98, an asterisk here. This, I don't believe, came through the education committees at all. I didn't, without the drafter.
But sort of,
Yep.
going back to
Health and welfare.
113.
Yep.
Have issues emerged around this, something about whether the high school is the diploma or something we need to be aware of here?
I think
That's emerged.
I think House Education heard some testimony that there are some students that were participating in the high school completion program that are now in limbo, based on implementation of the new adult education program and when they would like to be able to graduate, finish their program.
And do the students who go through that program end up with a diploma from a specific high school?
Correct.
Is that part of the issue that's emerged?
I don't know. I would encourage you to hear from the field exactly what has emerged.
Okay.
The law requires AOE to operate an adult education program, full stop. What I believe the testimony that the House Education heard was that program is not necessarily up and running yet. And therefore there are students that could have graduated under the high school completion program, but are waiting for the adult ed program to get up and running. Beyond that, I think you need to talk to the field. Yep.
That's
But yes, there is,
fine.
yes.
Okay. Yeah,
Yep. Kiddos are now permitted to, with written permission, possess and apply sunscreen on school property. And that lives in Title 16, so I just wanted you all to be aware of it. An act relating to Vermont's public libraries. You all have jurisdiction over libraries as well. This bill came out of an act that was commissioned, or a report that was commissioned on public libraries a couple of years ago. That report is hundreds and hundreds of pages, and this is the resulting legislation. So Act 150 adds a policy statement that states it is necessary for the governing bodies or managers of free public libraries to adopt policies that comply with the First Amendment and state and federal civil rights and anti-discrimination laws. It requires public libraries to adopt material selection policies and procedures for the reconsideration and retention of library materials that comply with the First Amendment, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, state anti-discrimination laws, and that reflect the diversity of Vermont. It amends the age up to which custodial parents or guardians have access to their child's library records from 16 to 12. Amends the criminal threatening statute in Title 13 to include public libraries to the list of places where, if conduct that constitutes criminal threatening occurs, the criminal penalty for such conduct is augmented. It amends the general powers and duties for public and municipal libraries and their governing bodies. It amends the duties and functions of the State Department of Libraries. And it requires each school board and each approved independent school to adopt a library material selection policy and procedures for the reconsideration and retention of materials guided by the First Amendment, Civil Rights Act of 1964, state anti-discrimination laws, and that reflect Vermont's diversity. 2024 Acts and Resolves number 139 is your literacy bill from last year. It requires AOE to review and publish guidance on universal reading screeners for both for use by public and approved independent schools that are eligible to receive public tuition, to use to screen all students in grades K through 3 at least annually, and to provide supplementary evidence-based reading instruction and ongoing monitoring of progress for students with screening results significantly below relevant benchmarks. It requires the reporting of certain data related to the use of those screeners to AOE, and then they are required to report back to you all on the state's progress in improving literacy and the data that they collected. It requires AOE to issue recommendations for the form and substance of parental notification for students with a screening result that is significantly below relevant benchmarks. It requires AOE to submit a list to the education committees of the universal reading screeners that's reviewed. Requires approved independent schools that are eligible to receive public tuition to develop grade level appropriate school literacy plans that are informed by student needs and assessment data. Public schools are already required to do this. It requires FCUs and approved independent schools that are eligible to receive public tuition to provide professional learning activities to K through 3 teachers. Requires AOE to make recommendations to the Vermont Standards Board on how to strengthen education preparation programs and their teaching of evidence-based literacy practices. It adds members to the Advisory Council on Literacy and extends their sunset date from 2024 to 2027. It converted one limited service position within AOE and one classified permanent position. Those were 2 positions created in Act 28 to permanent positions. And it required the Department of Libraries to submit a report to the education committees with recommendations for expanding access to early childhood literacy resources. There's a lot more to this bill. Act 117, again, I did not draft this bill, so if you have questions, I can connect you with the drafter, but an act relating to explaining employment protections. One section of this bill impacted the referendum procedure for representation in the teacher and administrator labor relations chapter. Act 136 started in this committee, an act relating to new American educational grant opportunities. It exempts persons with certain immigration statuses from 1-year residency requirements for the advancement grant administered through VSAC. It exempts people with that same immigration status from the 1-year residency requirement for the incentive grant program, also administered through VSAC through July 1, 2027. It establishes that a Vermont resident who is otherwise eligible for state-funded financial aid administered through VSAC shall not be ineligible solely on the basis of such resident's immigration status. It prevents the Board of Trustees from the Vermont State Colleges Corporation from adopting in-state tuition policies that would discriminate based solely on the person's immigration status, and the same for UVM. And then the Technical Corrections Bill from 2024 added the definition of Space Force to Armed Forces in the Armed Services Scholarship section, which I just thought was exciting. We're going to jump back up to Acts and Resolves. I'm on page 3, Acts and Resolves, number 183, the Yield Bill. So it created the Commission on the Future of Public Education, which is still ongoing. They have a meeting on Monday. It set the yields. It made pre-written software accessed remotely, subject to sales tax. It imposed a 3% surcharge on rent of each occupancy of short-term rental, and the revenue would go to the ed fund. It required AOE to update the district quality standards to include recommended reserve fund account standards for school districts. It amended the school district ballot language requirement to be used starting at fiscal year 2026 vote. And it also reinstated the requirement to use that ballot language that was suspended in Act 127. It creates the Ed Fund Advisory Committee, which is a standing committee to monitor the education finance system and make recommendations to you all. That advisory committee was created in this bill, and it doesn't really, the thought behind it is that it wouldn't start until next summer. Or excuse me, this summer. It created a statewide adjustment when factoring the CLA into school district rates. It reactivated excess spending penalties for districts that spend more than 118% of the statewide average per pupil ed spending. Prior to Act 183, it was 120%, so there was an amendment there. And it removed the statutory exemptions for the calculation of excess spending, but created one new exemption for payments towards bonds that were approved prior to July 1, 2024. Requires the Department of Taxes to report on potential improvements to property tax credit claims. Made several conforming amendments to reflect changes made in Act 127. And then there were some transfers to towns to compensate for education tax overpayments due to erroneous accounting of certain students in ADM calculations. So that was the yield bill from last year. The bulk of this work happened in the Finance Committee, but this committee spent a significant amount of time on the creation of the Commission on the Future of Public Education. And that's what you all did the last 2 years.
So I'd be interested, not for you, because you will say get the right people in. But I'd be interested in checking in on the progress of the literacy efforts. I'm not sure who the right people are, but we'll figure that out. We'll take it in. I think it's teachers. So
I'd be interested in the reports that are due to us that we haven't got to see.
good point. Yes, we have, some have come. You mentioned one that was supposed to do it years ago.
December.
CTE governance. I believe the pre-K, I can put together a list of reports and email it to you all.
Anything else? Any questions? Anybody? Thoughts? Anything you want to hear more on? I think you just identified a couple. Thank you.
You're welcome.
See you soon.
How are we doing?
Yes. These are your education law books. You're going to change everything in there this year.
And with